asset protection planning firm BarthCalderon. Thanks for checking into the Culture of Asset Protection TV channel here on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed yet, click below. There's a link because we put out some really great videos on planning issues, and my colleague Brad Barth is doing this video, and he is a top speaker on estate and asset protection planning to a ton of groups across the country. This is a really important topic. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for checking in, and I'll see you next time.
A question is often asked, what type of estate planning is best when I have a blended family? Many times, and modernly, we do have a lot of clients who come to us who are having a second marriage or sometimes even a third marriage. They have either minor kids of their own, or they have adult kids, or between the two of them there could be a combination of both adult and minor kids on both sides. So the question is, what's some of the best tools and techniques that we use for estate planning for the modern blended family? I think a very important discussion to start off with is to understand the nature and character of assets coming into that blended family relationship. In California, mostly you have two different types of property. You have either separate property or you have community property. And the date of marriage is an important date. It's an important anchor date because all property acquired before marriage that you're bringing into the new relationship is pretty much deemed separate property. And that will retain its separate property characteristics to the extent that you keep it separate property. Now, through your behaviors, if you commingle those assets beyond the ability to trace back where those original source funds came from, then California law will basically deem that to become a community property asset. We call that a transmutation from separate property to community property. Again, back to that anchor date, all assets acquired after marriage, however, typically are deemed community property, meaning each spouse has a 50-50 buy-in into those assets. So I think an important note is that when we have clients come to us from blended families, one of the very first questions I always ask, well, do you have a premarital agreement? Did you categorize those assets before marriage? So will assets retain their separate property characterization? And if you didn't have that discussion regarding premarital assets, sometimes that conversation can take place after the fact. We call it a post-marital agreement. Premarital agreement would be before marriage, post-marital will be after marriage. So here again, how do we categorize assets after marriage? And that categorization is very important because if in a blended family situation, you want to make sure that your kids that you're coming into the marriage with are being taken care of and the other spouse is also taken care of, then it's very important how we categorize those assets, because what tools we have for the benefit of our ultimate beneficiaries, our children, will make a difference in how those assets are categorized. So one of the first questions we always ask is whether you have a pre or post-marital agreement, and sometimes this may be an appropriate time as part of a comprehensive estate plan to address those property characterization questions. The next thing I always come up with is many times they want to keep the plan simple. They want to have one trust. And in situations like this, I like to come up with what I call the his, the hers, and the our type of arrangement. His estate plan will basically allow for the primary beneficiary to be the new spouse, but upon the new spouse's passing, his assets will pour down to his kids. On her trust, again, during her husband's remaining lifetime, he'll be the primary beneficiary, but then upon his passing, her assets go down to her kids. And then they have those assets they're accumulating together. We call that the our trust. Again, they'll be the primary beneficiary for each other, and then many times we'll wind up splitting those assets, and his half goes to his kids, and her half goes to her kids. I call that the his, hers, and our arrangement. Again, a very common arrangement, again, and having that pre or post-marital agreement, that asset characterization is a very important tool, so we know what assets are going to be deemed his separate, what assets are going to be deemed her separate, and what assets are they accumulating together during community property, if at all. So that's a very important part of an estate plan as well. Another thing that we're concerned about is, especially when you have adult kids coming into a new marriage, many times the two couples, the new spouses, get along just fine, but sometimes the kids that are coming into that relationship don't have the same, let's just say, love and affection for the new spouse that their biological parent does. So many times one of the big and real concerns we have is, well, so long as the new spouses are alive, everything is fine. But if all of a sudden one spouse passes away, and if that spouse is then going to have access, the surviving spouse is going to have access to now the deceased spouse's assets, how do we protect the surviving spouse from the harassment or claims from the now deceased spouse's biological kids? They're basically coming after what I call the evil stepmom or the evil stepdad scenario. And so although we can address some of those issues within what I call the his, hers, and our arrangements, many times I like to use, believe it or not, another trust. Sometimes we use life insurance as part of this overall tool. So should one spouse pass away, insurance is immediately available to take care of their kids. So while the other surviving spouse can continue to use those assets unhampered by the deceased spouse's kids. So sometimes life insurance planning is a very important part of a blended family scenario as well. And it works on both sides. So if you have one spouse passes away, that spouse's kids get life insurance, and then the assets are available for the health, support, and maintenance of the surviving spouse, and vice versa. If the other spouse passes away, a life insurance policy can be used as well. That's one way to make sure that the kids are taken care of and they don't feel they have to wait for the new spouse to pass away before they're able to take advantage or to have benefit of their parents' inheritance. I think another important thing that gets overlooked a lot when we deal with blended families is updating life insurance policies. And this is a big confusion I found over the years, that many times that when somebody passes away, they think when they modify their estate plan, that encompasses all the assets. Well, there's two categories of assets, actually three categories of assets, that are not affected by the estate plan. So even though you may have a new marriage, even though you work with a lawyer and you come up with the his, her, the ours, or some type of planning to deal with the disposition of assets for each other, we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently still have assets out there for the benefit of our now former spouses. So one area we look at is life insurance policies. Life insurance policies go by way of contract. Whomever is listed as the beneficiary of life insurance policy, they receive the death benefit. So even though you may have an updated estate plan, which is used exclusively for the benefit of your new spouse, if your old spouse is listed as a beneficiary by name, he or she is going to be the beneficiary of that life insurance policy, notwithstanding what your estate plan says. And that comes as a shock for a lot of people because they thought that when they updated their estate plan, that also directed all the assets, and that's not correct. Life insurance policies, retirement assets, and assets that are held in joint tenancy go to the listed beneficiary or the surviving joint owner regardless of what the estate plan says and regardless of the will says. So one thing I want to make sure we always take a look at is that we updated our life insurance policies to remove the former spouse and to list our trust or our kids, again, as part of my life insurance planning, our kids as the beneficiary of our life insurance policies. And that also affects our retirement assets as well. Many times when you have a separation of assets, you've already gone through a quadro, which is a qualified domestic relations orders, which pretty much already dealt with the retirement assets. So I don't see this as such a problem, but it's one thing we always want to check to make sure that your retirement beneficiaries are also updated to make sure that the new plan, the new family structure is addressed in there as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is as far as jointly held assets. So here again, if you have an account in joint tenancy, or maybe you have a piece of property out there that was held in joint tenancy with your former or now former spouse, again, because of the nature of joint tenancy, if you pass away, that property will go automatically by operation of law to the surviving joint tenant. And if that surviving joint tenant is your former spouse, they're going to wind up being the beneficiary of that property, and that property will not be included for the benefit of your new spouse or for your kids. So those are some of the areas that I see, that some of the challenges that we see in the estate planning world when it comes to dealing with modern blended families. So if you have that situation, I please recommend that you reach out to our office, maybe schedule a complimentary consultation, and so we can address some of these estate planning options for you. Other than that, thank you for your attention. This is Brad Barth, partner of BarthCalderon, where we plan today for all your tomorrows. Thank you. Bye-bye.